They built pyramids, worshipped animals, and mapped the stars. But they also had a talent for finding ways to exit reality for a bit. In ancient Egypt, getting high wasn't just for vibes, it was tied to medicine, rituals, and wild natural mixtures that would make modern party stories sound boring. Their world wasn't just golden and sacred, it was experimental, psychedelic, and honestly way weirder than you'd think. If you enjoy stories like this, a like or subscribe would mean a lot. And please tell me where you're listening from. It never stops being awesome seeing the whole world in one comment section. All right, tonight we're cracking open a side of history you definitely didn't learn in class. How ancient Egyptians got higher. So sink into that pillow, relax your mind, and let's drift back to the Nile.
Let's start with the ancient Egyptians' most famous botanical party trick, the blue lotus flower. You've probably seen it in tomb paintings, elegant petals, usually being sniffed by pharaohs or gently waved around at banquets is like an ancient version of cheers. But this flower wasn't just ornamental. The Egyptians believed it had sacred properties and mild psychoactive ones. Yes, the blue lotus could get you just a little bit floaty. The method was simple. Take the dried petals and soak them in wine for a while, sometimes days. Then drink the infusion at festivals, ceremonies, or presumably whenever you felt like tuning out the sound of 200 people chanting hymns at top volume. The result was a soft, dreamy euphoria. Not enough to make you forget your name, but enough to make pyramid building sound like a fun group project. Now, to be clear, the Egyptians didn't call it getting high. They called it communing with the gods. Blue lotus was strongly associated with rebirth and the sun god Ra, which made it perfect for temple rituals and rary rites. Holding the flower to one's nose was a symbolic way of inhaling divinity. And okay, maybe also a great way to take the edge off after a long day of ruling the Nile Valley. It was everywhere in art. Pharaohs are shown holding it. Party guests at banquets are passing it around like a floral peace pipe. And even mummies got decorated with it for the afterlife. The thinking seemed to be, if we're travelling to eternity, let's make sure we're stocked up. Practical. But the blue lotus wasn't just ceremonial. Festivals could get wild, and blue lotus infused wine made the music louder, the dancing looser, and the hieroglyphic poetry marginally more profound. Imagine a crowd under the stars sipping lotus wine, feeling as light as a papyrus reed in the breeze. For the ancient Egyptians, that was spiritual fulfillment and also a very good night. There are religious holidays. And then there's the Feast of Drunkenness, the ancient Egyptian equivalent of saying, let's black out in honour of not dying. Subtle name? No, accurate. Extremely. This annual celebration revolved around the goddess Hathor, who according to myth was once sent to punish humanity. But after a bloody spree that would make any disaster movie blush, the gods decided humanity had maybe learned its lesson. So they tricked her into drinking red beer that looked like blood. She passed out, woke up in a better mood, and just like that, mass extinction was narrowly avoided through alcohol poisoning. To commemorate this heroic hangover, Egyptians gathered once a year to get thoroughly obliterated. Not metaphorically, not spiritually, literally. The goal was to drink until one entered a divine trance, which sounds poetic until you remember this often meant collapsing face, first into a mud brick courtyard surrounded by strangers yelling praises between hiccups. The ritual began at dawn with music, clapping, and the ceremonial passing of drinks. Priests encouraged revelers to drink as much as your heart desires, which in this context was less of a blessing and more of a dare. Participants banged tambourines, danced in the streets, and reportedly saw the goddess, although whether that was Hathatha or just the side of a clay jug is unclear. But this wasn't just chaos for chaos's sake. Well, mostly not. The idea was to honour the balance between destruction and joy, reminding everyone that even wrathful deities could be pacified with the strong enough brew. Think of it as theology meets keg stand. And importantly, this was sanctioned behaviour. There were no awkward conversations the next day about what happened in the sacred grove. Getting drunk was part of the job description. If anything, not passing out was suspicious. Why aren't you spiritually elevated, Kumotip? Do you hate the gods? Modern scholars have described the Feast of Drunkenness as a ritual of renewal. Participants purge their fears, inhibitions, and likely their stomach contents, all in one divinely authorised party. The next day, headaches, regret, possibly a new scar shaped like Anubis, but also spiritual cleansing. Forget everything you know about beer. Ancient Egyptian beer wasn't golden, bubbly, or anything remotely resembling a beverage you'd order at a bar. It was thick, porridge-like, and alarmingly opaque, served with a kind of consistency that would confuse both your bartender and your dentist. Beer for the Egyptians was not just a social drink, it was practically a food group made from partially baked loaves of emmer bread that was soaked in water, mashed and fermented into a chunky slurry. It resembled a soupy oatmeal more than a refreshing ale. The technical term might be liquid bread. But let's not pretend this wasn't a bowl of carbs in denial. This beer was consumed by everyone: peasants, priests, children, scribes, and anyone else trying to survive in a world where desert heat, crocodiles, and public works projects were daily concerns. It was calorically dense, slightly intoxicating, and cheaper than anything else that didn't require chasing it down with a spear. And here's the twist. Beer wasn't just for sustenance. It was often intentionally altered with herbs, spices, and other curious additives, especially during festivals or religious ceremonies. Want to commune with the gods? Add some mandrake. Want to forget the priest's speech about cosmic order? Toss in a little fermented date juice and hope for the best. Of course, hygiene was a concern, but beer had an answer for that too. Water could kill you, but beer had been boiled, fermented, and spiced. It was safer than the Nile and often more reliable than your co-workers. In terms of strength, Egyptian beer ranged from mildly numbing to I forgot how sandals work. While the alcohol content wasn't high by modern standards, the sheer quantity consumed made up for it. Workers on state projects like pyramid building were often paid in beer, a daily ration of several litres, which means that half of ancient Egyptian labour was fueled by liquid gluten and mild intoxication. Let's talk beer, or rather, let's talk about a viscous, beige bread-adjacent fluid that the ancient Egyptians cheerfully called beer, and that modern brewers would call a war crime. Egyptian beer was less refreshing beverage and more fermented soup with ambition, made by soaking half-baked loaves of emmer bread in water, then mashing the whole affair into a lumpy stew and letting it ferment in open vats. The final product was cloudy, chunky, and distressingly chewable. Imagine oatmeal if oatmeal had opinions and a mild buzz. But despite its texture, which archaeologists generously describe as rustic, this was the drink of the people. Everyone drank it: pharaohs, priests, peasants, toddlers. Because when water might kill you and milk was suspicious at best, beer was the least deadly option with a pleasant side effect. It was calorie dense, mildly intoxicating, and often served in communal jugs. Because nothing says spiritual unity like 5 adults slurping from a pot of soggy breadwater. At temples and festivals, the beer might be enhanced with herbs, dates, honey, or mystery ingredients that were either sacred or just experimental. Historians are still unsure if the addition of mandre was intentional, or if someone was just tired of reality. This was also the go-to payment method for labourers. Pyramid workers didn't clock out with coins. They received daily beer rations, sometimes several litres per day. This means the guys hauling limestone blocks all morning were doing it buzzed and breaded. And somehow the pyramids still got built. Let that sink in the next time you miss a deadline with a cappuccino in hand. Taste probably awful, but if you're living in 1300 BCE covered in sand and trying not to die of dysentery, a lukewarm jar of beer porridge is Michelin star cuisine. Also, no foam, no carbonation, no glass bottles, just ceramic jugs, straws with filters to catch the bigger bread chunks, and a national commitment to ignoring mouthfeel. Now that you've washed down your bread beer with a floral buzz, it's time to set the mood with smoke. But not just any smoke. We're talking kifi, the ancient Egyptian incense that made temples smell like divine bakeries and left everyone wondering if they were actually meditating or just very, very light-aided. Kifi wasn't a quick hit of frankincense. This was the perfumed love child of an apothecary and a pastry chef. Recipes varied by temple, but the ingredients often included myrrh, honey, wine, raisins, cinnamon, juniper, mint, and whatever other spices were lying around not being sacrificed. Mix it all up, let it ferment, dry it into pellets, and burn them slowly in sacred spaces until everyone either felt deeply spiritual or forgot why they walked in. It was used in ritual purification, which is code for, let's fill this room with enough fragrant smoke to erase our sins, or at least our memories of last night's feast of drunkenness. Temples didn't have ventilation, by the way. That was considered breaking the mood. So imagine standing in a limestone cube next to a sweating priest waving a smoking dish of kefi like it's frizz for the soul, while a chant drones in Coptic monotone behind you. Visions weren't just encouraged, they were practically inevitable. Whether divine revelation or mild asphyxiation, it didn't really matter. The gods got their tribute either way. To the Egyptians, ki wasn't just air freshener. It was medicine, perfume, and spiritual elevator Al-Anon. Pliny the Elder later wrote that kifi could cure snake bites and improve sleep, which makes sense if you assume the goal was to pass out entirely. Some recipes were so complex they read like ancient IKEA manuals. 16 ingredients, each added in precise phases under specific moons. Honestly, it's a miracle anything got done. But once lit, the aroma drifted across the Nile like a sacred fog machine, signalling that something holy was happening, or that someone was overcompensating for yesterday's fish market. Even in death, kifi lingered. It was burned during mummification, buried in tombs, and probably responsible for at least one pharaoh being accidentally embalmed in a spice rub. In short, kifi was Egypt's way of saying, if you can't drink it, burn it and breathe deeply. If Blue Lotus was Egypt's chill friend, and kifi was the drama queen with a smoke machine, then mandre was the slightly unhinged guest you invited once and immediately regretted. With its forked roots that vaguely resembled tiny humans and a reputation that scared even seasoned priests, Mandre was less herbal remedy and more botanical dare, used in ancient Egyptian medicine as both a painkiller and a possible aphrodisiac, which is always a terrifying combination. Mandre earned its place in temple recipes and medical scrolls with the kind of cautious reverence usually reserved for wild animals and pharaohs in a bad mood. The IBA's papyrus, that handy ancient medical text that sounds like it belongs in a Harry Potter class, lists mandri for insomnia, fertility, and strengthening the heart, which sounds noble until you remember that the wrong dose could just as easily strengthen your heart into cardiac arrest. See, mandri contains alkaloids, like scopolamine and atropine, the kind of compounds that mess with your nervous system and occasionally convince you that your bed is melting. In small doses, it was mildly relaxing. In slightly bigger ones, welcome to Night Terrors, starring Ra and a crocodile in a wig. And then there's the harvesting myth. According to later folklore, likely inherited from these early associations, pulling a mandrake root out of the ground caused it to scream loudly, lethally. So naturally the solution was to tie it to a dog, cover your ears and let the poor creature yank it free, while you hoped your neighbours didn't ask too many questions. While there's no solid evidence the Egyptians were tying plants to dogs and waiting for shrieks, the idea that the plant had spiritual and slightly terrifying power fits right in. Mandre may have been used in rituals, fertility rites, or just slipped into beer for those who preferred their hallucinations with a rooty aftertaste. In any case, it wasn't the everyday herb. Mandri was for priests, magicians, and those who didn't mind taking medical advice from a man covered in gold leaf. Used carefully, it could induce sleep, reduce pain, and maybe inspire a sensual poem or two. Used recklessly, you'd wake up 4 days later convinced you were a scarab beetle. Somewhere in the vast scrolls of Egyptian medical wisdom, wedged between cures for crocodile bites and the proper placement of amulets on inflamed body parts, lies a quiet little mention of Shemet. That's right, cannabis, because when it came to pain relief, the ancient Egyptians didn't just rely on divine intervention or chewing reeds until they forgot their problems. Sometimes they reached for something a little more herbal. Cannabis appears in medical texts like the Ebers Papyrus and Ramesseum Papyrus, mostly as a treatment for inflammation, sore eyes, and various gynecological complaints. Yes, gynecological. Ancient Egyptian women may have had access to THC-infused suppositories, which sounds like a modern wellness trend someone is definitely going to try to resurrect on Etsy. Of course, the Egyptians didn't roll joints or bake brownies with it, at least not that we know of. Cannabis was usually crushed into oils, mixed into salves, or blended with honey. Because if you're going to medicate, why not make it taste nice? Applied topically, it soothed pain. Inhaled accidentally. Well, now the temple incense makes a lot more sense. Was it recreational? Officially, no. Unofficially, probably when you're running a civilization in 120-degree heat with limited plumbing and a deeply unpredictable crocodile problem, no one blames you for accidentally over-medicating. And if your high priest starts talking to statues a little too confidently, well, who's to say that isn't divine wisdom? There's also physical evidence. Residue analysis from mummies and burial sites has turned up trace amounts of cannabis, along with opium and nicotine, which raises either some fascinating pharmacological questions or the world's most suspicious funeral offerings. And let's not ignore the priests. These were men trained to chant for hours, interpret dreams, and stare into incense smoke until something stared back. If their rituals involved cannabis, it wasn't for giggles. It was to facilitate communication with the gods, or at the very least with the wall. Somewhere in the dimly lit, sweet-smelling corners of the ancient Egyptian temple pharmacy, just behind the dried lizards and holy ointments, sat the opium stash. Small wrinkled poppy pods imported from the eastern Mediterranean, tucked away like a divine secret. Because when you've got plague, pain and pyramid-related back injuries, sometimes prayer alone doesn't cut it. Though not native to Egypt, opium poppies likely made their debut through trade with Cyprus or Sit. The Egyptians were nothing if not enthusiastic early adopters. By the time of the New Kingdom, poppies were well on their way to becoming the ancient world's go-to sedative, a medical miracle wrapped in mild addiction. Opium didn't just dull pain, it smoothed over childbirth, calmed coughs, soothed gastrointestinal rage, and made temple chants about cosmic balance feel like they actually had a beat. Administered in drinks, pills, or occasionally as suppositories, because of course, it became the pharmaceutical equivalent of saying, "Shh, don't worry about it." Naturally, it found a home in the temple medicine cabinet, that sacred shelf where healing met holy mystery. Priests double in as physicians administered it during rituals and serious treatments, probably while saying things like, "This will ease the divine tension in your spleen." Whether your god was angry or your mers were, opium could calm them both. The ancient texts don't call it opium directly. Of course, that would be too helpful. They reference extracts from the poppy plant in the same vague way modern labels say natural flavours, which is never comforting. But let's not pretend this was all medicinal. There's always a blurry line between spiritual elevation and a really good nap. And for elite Egyptians, especially those being embalmed, opium might have been part of the final send-off. What better way to face the underworld than totally blissed out and blissfully unaware of the scarab beetle crawling across your nose? Like many of Egypt's sacred substances, opium was part cure, part comfort, and part controlled chaos. Used wisely, it soothed agony. Used poorly, it turned temple assistants into spaced-out background dancers. Still, in a world of tooth drills, snakes and sandstorms, a little somnolent magic went a long way. Wine in ancient Egypt was a sign of sophistication, a drink of the gods, a toast to Osiris, but don't let the elegant amphorae fool you. This stuff could hit like a chariot accident, especially when it came laced with the ancient equivalent of a little something extra. Wines weren't just fermented grape juice. They were infusions, concoctions, and occasionally mild experiments in altered consciousness. Egyptians flavoured their wine with everything from mandrake and blue lotus to myrrh and frankincense. Ingredients that sound spiritual until you realise they were probably added for maximum mood enhancement. Religious festivals were the main setting for these potent portables. At the Feast of Drunkenness, for example, participants didn't sip wine to appreciate terroir. They chugged it to achieve metaphysical disconnection. The idea wasn't to be tipsy, it was to teeter between dimensions, possibly while dancing with a priest in a leopard skin. These spiked brews were often described in medical texts as remedies, which is how you know things were getting creative. Got a headache? Try a wine infused with fermented lotus. Sore joints? How about some frankincense infused red aged 2 weeks in a clay pot? Existential dread. Well, that one needed priestly supervision and possibly a floor mat. And it wasn't just mortals enjoying this liquid therapy. The gods themselves were believed to appreciate a good spiked offering. Vats of wine were ritually poured out in temples, left as offerings in tombs, and used in ceremonies to help the divine descend into statues, or at least wobble in their general direction. Let's be clear, this wasn't your average table wine. Depending on the additives, these sacred brews could calm nerves, ease pain, or launch a midsummer banquet into full psychedelic mystery cult territory. And because everything was part of a ritual, no one could really question the dosage. If the room spun, it was spiritual. If you passed out in the lotus garden, that was divine communion. For the ancient Egyptians, wine wasn't just a beverage. It was a vehicle, one that could take you to enlightenment, to sleep, or into the arms of a very confused crocodile god. For a civilization obsessed with order, ritual and geometry, the ancient Egyptians had a surprisingly open mind about trance states. In fact, they encouraged them, just not during accounting. These altered mental states were seen as direct channels to the divine, or at least to some deeply theatrical inner monologue. Possession, divine, not demonic, was often treated as a religious promotion, not a medical emergency. If a temple dancer started convulsing mid-rhyme, she wasn't rushed out by worried acolytes, she was applauded. Hathor had arrived, apparently, and had strong opinions about tambourine tempo. These trances were often achieved through a time-honoured combo of repetitive drumming, rhythmic chanting, smoke inhalation, sleep deprivation, and wine with mysterious floaties in it. The result? Sudden bouts of prophecy, dramatic gasping, and the occasional unplanned floor nap. Priests and priestesses alike were trained to host gods like Airbnb guests, welcoming them into their bodies during rituals. This included changes in voice, posture, and a sudden urge to announce cryptic things while staring into a fire. In many temples, it was just another Wednesday. To outsiders, it may have looked like a mass fainting spell, but within the temple, this was how messages from the gods were delivered. Sometimes the gods advised, sometimes they scolded, sometimes they demanded more cake offerings, which says a lot about ancient theology and ancient appetites. The trance wasn't always voluntary either. There are accounts of the afflicted being taken by deities, often accompanied by shouting, shaking, and suspicious amounts of incense. Whether these were actual divine messages or simply what happens when you inhale 4 hours of kifi smoke next to a flaming brazier is still debated. Of course, once the trance ended, the possessed party returned to normal, often looking slightly disoriented and very sweaty. The ritual concluded with applause, a sip of sacred wine, and possibly a nap behind a pillar while someone else mopped up the sanctified drool. To modernise, divine possession might look like performance art meets heat stroke. But to ancient Egyptians, it was the pinnacle of religious experience, the moment when the divine broke through the sandstone barrier of reality to drop a few cryptic life tips. You'd think death would be enough to stop someone from getting invited to a party. Not in ancient Egypt. The line between the living and the dead was more of a soft suggestion, like don't swim after eating, or maybe don't chisel hieroglyphs drunk. Egyptians didn't just respect the dead, they actively included them in social plans. This wasn't metaphorical. Families visited tombs during festivals like the beautiful Feast of the Valley, lugging baskets of food, jugs of beer, and the general vibe of a tailgate party if the tailgate was parked in a necropolis. They'd sit outside the tomb, eat, drink, and commune with the deceased, which usually meant talking to the wall and hoping Grandma appreciated the pickled fish. Many tombs had false doors, carved portals through which the dead could receive offerings. Whether this meant spiritually or just enjoying the smell from the other side is unclear. Either way, ancient Egyptians believed the dead could still enjoy food, drink, music, and a decent bit of gossip. So naturally they threw them parties. Music was played, incense was burned, libations were poured. Sometimes the living got drunk enough to cry, confess secrets, or accidentally sit on sacred offerings. It was like a family reunion, only with fewer arguments and slightly more embalming fluid. These gatherings weren't just acts of remembrance. They were also mutually beneficial transactions. The living fed the dead. The dead, in theory, blessed the living in return. Good crops, protection, fewer nightmares involving hippos. Everyone won. Sometimes people even slept overnight in tombs, hoping for dream visions from their departed loved ones or the occasional unsolicited advice from a former accountant turned ghost. Stop lending money to your brother, the dream might say. And also, the amulets go on the left. To modern sensibilities, this sounds macabre. To the Egyptians, it was completely logical. The afterlife wasn't a goodbye. It was just a new address. And if Great Uncle Horm wanted to attend the party via divine osmosis through a stone wall, who were they to say no? For all the incense, holy trances and sanctioned debauchery, ancient Egyptian revelry came with a price, and it usually arrived sometime around sunrise with a pounding headache and the vague memory of yelling at a statue. Yes, even in a world where Blue Lotus was medicine and beer was breakfast, the morning after hit just as hard. Archaeological texts are suspiciously quiet on the subject of hangovers, which is probably because no one was in the mood to write hieroglyphs when their head felt like it had been smited by Re himself. But the evidence is there. Medical papyri describe pains of the head and recommend treatments involving herbs, honey, and sometimes just lying very still while pretending to commune with the gods. In more advanced cases, a ritual cleansing was recommended, which usually involved a priest, a bucket of cold Nile water, and possibly a stern lecture on moderation that no one remembered hearing. The real trick, of course, was plausible deniability. If you danced shirtless in the temple or passed out in a tomb alcove, you didn't say, "I overdid it." You said, "I was overcome by the divine." It wasn't a blackout. It was a mystical encounter with Hathor's laughter, much more respectable. And for the truly unlucky, there was always purging, not metaphorically, literally. The Egyptians were fond of aches, lovely concoctions designed to evacuate your sins from both ends. Imagine being handed a drink that tastes like regret and being told, "This will restore your balance." Moments later, your balance is definitely gone. The priests, of course, fared better. They had training, they had ritual authority, and most importantly, they had people to carry them home. Meanwhile, common revellers woke up with lotus petals in their hair and sandal imprints on their faces, wondering whether they danced with a god or just someone very committed to the role. Still, no one swore off the next celebration because spiritual enlightenment, as it turns out, is addictive, especially when it comes with beer, smoke, and a mild chance of falling into a trance and yelling your neighbour's secrets in front of a statue. When ancient Egyptians prepared for death, they didn't just pack linens and a decent eulogy. They packed snacks and drugs and possibly a backup stash, just in case eternity got boring. Because if you thought the partying stopped after your heart was weighed, think again. It just moved underground. Tombs weren't silent, solemn places. They were carefully curated starter homes with a soul, complete with food, booze, and mood-enhancing herbal arrangements. Mummies were entombed with blue lotus petals, wine jugs, incense cones, and the occasional sealed mystery jar, which archaeologists now eye with both reverence and mild suspicion. Take Tutankhamun, for example. When Howard Carter cracked open his tomb, he didn't just find gold and furniture. He found wine, oils, herbs, and what can only be described as the ancient Egyptian version of a wellness kit. If a modern influencer were buried today, it would look disturbingly similar, minus the canopic jars. This wasn't just luxury, it was strategic. The soul, or bar, if you're fancy, needed nourishment and stimulation in the afterlife. Eternal bliss wasn't going to maintain itself after all. So priests and imbalameras made sure you were entombed with all your spiritual comfort items, food offerings, sacred perfume, and a generous dose of whatever got you through long temple ceremonies while pretending to be enlightened. Some tombs even include instructions to the dead on how to prepare and enjoy these items in the afterlife. It's not enough to carry Blue Lotus into eternity. Apparently you also needed directions in case divine short-term memory was a thing. And let's not forget the opening of the mouth ritual, which was supposed to let the dead eat, speak, and let's be honest, sip that sacred fermented beverage with proper technique. Because it's hard to toast Osiris with a closed jaw. All of this tells us one very clear thing. The ancient Egyptians did not separate pleasure from piety. If something brought them closer to the gods in life, even if it was a psychoactive flower soaked in wine, it belonged in the tomb along with your amulets, your linen headrest, and possibly a starter pack of dreams. Ancient Egypt gave the world pyramids, mummies, and eyeliner that could block out the sun. But it also perfected an unspoken truth of civilization. Sometimes the people running things are just high enough to think it's going well. Officially, the pharaoh was the earthly embodiment of Horus, chosen by the gods to maintain Mayat cosmic order. Unofficially, temple priests had the keys to the sacred stash, the incense budget, and the daily schedule of who gets to chant next to a burning bush of Kai until they pass out. The religious elite weren't just spiritual guides, they were state-sanctioned pharmacists supplying the population with everything from calming ointments to full-blown psychedelic experiences disguised as Holy Communion. If it smelled strong, tingled on contact, or made you speak in metaphor for 3 days, it probably came out of the priesthood's apothecary. And while pharaohs wore the crowns, it was the priests who knew how to blend mandra with wine and not kill anyone. This gave them an enormous amount of soft power, not just in healing and ritual, but in managing the emotional and mystical tone of society. You didn't ask, "What's going on with the harvest?" You asked, "What did the high priest see in his trance last night?" Spoiler, it was usually a falcon and a lot of swirling gold light. Let's not forget the economic side. The temples were landowners, employers, and massive centres of drug production. Blue Lotus didn't grow itself. Someone had to harvest it, dry it, ferment it, and whisper to it in sacred verse. So yes, religion was very holy, but it was also a well-oiled machine, one that ran on faith, herbs, and occasionally mind-altering doses of divine inspiration. In many ways, the question of who ruled Egypt was less about crowns and more about who controlled the incense burners. Because if the gods spoke through visions, and the visions came after a priest sniffed something pungent in a sealed chamber, well, you do the math. In theory, ancient Egypt was all about balance, justice, and order. In practice, if you were rich enough to afford a private tomb and someone to fan you while you digested, You also had access to the good stuff, the kind of narcotic rarities that didn't show up in the village clinic scrolls. Make no mistake, ancient Egyptian society was a hierarchy, and mind-altering substances followed the same rules as everything else. Pharaoh at the top, goat herder at the bottom, and everyone else politely sniffing dried flowers and pretending it was enough. While commoners got barley beer and maybe a whiff of temple incense if they leaned close enough, the elite were bathing in blue lotus oil and sipping spiked pomegranate wine out of gold-rimmed chalices. Some of the more potent substances, mandrake blends laced with opium, imported cannabis resins, were likely restricted to ritual or medical use, which just happened to align perfectly with the daily schedules of court officials and high priests. Funny how that worked out. Take Pharaoh himself. The divine ruler of Upper and Lower Egypt couldn't be expected to process the metaphysical weight of ruling without a little help from the sacred pharmacopoeia. If his dreams were considered state messages from the gods, then sedating his insomnia with a psychoactive nightcap wasn't indulgence. It was national security. Even in death, the elite kept their stash close. Many tombs contain medicinal vials, incense cones and wine jars with labels so vague they may as well have read for ceremonial purposes only. One wonders if the gods actually required that much imported poppy resin, or if Tutankhamun just liked to keep his options open. Meanwhile, the lower classes weren't exactly locked out of the experience. They just had to settle for the watered-down versions. Beer thick enough to chew, weak incense, and whatever passed for spiritual euphoria during an 18-hour shift building obelisks. And when someone did get their hands on a forbidden substance without a permit, that was likely called witchcraft, heresy, or a very bad day to be a field labourer. After 14 chapters of sacred snorting, divine day drinking, and hallucinogenic healthcare, one might be tempted to ask, what does all this really say about ancient Egypt? Well, for starters, it tells us they were brilliant at blending science, spirituality, and recreational chemistry into a single belief system. Pain relief and prophecy came from the same flower. Medicine and mysticism walked hand in hand, usually to the beat of a serum and the smell of something smouldering that definitely wasn't FDA approved. It also reveals just how much the ancients respected the power of altered states, not as escapism, but as a legitimate way to access insight, healing, and the occasional god with an animal head and a flair for drama. Their rituals weren't just pageantry, they were controlled chemical theatre with incense, chanting, and psychotropic tea for the caste and the strict gatekeeping of sacred substances. That's just the ancient version of putting wellness behind a paywall. The elite had their Blue Lotus spas and imported opium. Everyone else got lukewarm beer and an eye infection. Divine enlightenment was available, but only if you could afford the luxury tomb package with optional afterlife miniar. But perhaps the most revealing takeaway is this. Humans have always wanted to feel more, see more, and know more, especially if it involves lying down in a temple and not doing chores. The ancient Egyptians weren't that different from modern humans meditating with essential oils or arguing about micro-doing podcasts. They just wore more eyeliner and took their hallucinations more seriously. So, what does this mean for us? Well, maybe that our ancestors weren't primitive drug enthusiasts or eccentric spiritualists. Maybe they were just doing their best to navigate a confusing, beautiful, often painful world with the tools, rituals, and fragrant smoke they had. And if that journey to inner peace happened to involve wine, wildflowers, and a trance where you barked like Anubis, so be it. Florence, late 1400s. The air was thick with incense, sweat, and the perfume of crushed roses. The city was bursting with art, intellect, and political intrigue, but also a very specific kind of madness, the obsession with beauty, and not just any beauty, Renaissance beauty, the kind that meant looking like a porcelain statue, even if it killed you. Enter Sarasa, a luxurious silky white face paint made from, you guessed it, lead. Yes, actual lead. Women across Florence, Venice and beyond smeared this shimmering poison across their cheeks, foreheads and décolletage to achieve that ultra-pale, ethereal look. Because in a world where tan skin meant labouring under the sun like a peasant, looking like a walking cadaver was the ultimate flex. But this wasn't just a light dusting of powder. No, Sarasa was layered on like Venetian stucco. Some women went so far as to sleep in it, refusing to wash their faces, allowing the toxic compound to literally soak into their skin. The result? A radiant, ghostly glow right up until the sores appeared, and when they did, they just applied more lead to cover them. You know, like a Renaissance band-aid, one that guaranteed the wound would never heal. If the lead didn't get you, the mercury might. Used to treat blemishes and fade sunspots, mercury was another charming element in the Renaissance beauty arsenal. Combine that with arsenic-based tonics and vinegar face baths, and you had a full-blown chemical warfare routine marketed as elegance. And let's not forget the classism baked into every powdered pore. Noble women wanted their skin to look untouched by sunlight or hardship, so the paler the better, even if it made them anemic, delirious, or eventually dead. Looking divine came at a divine cost. But perhaps the most ironic part, the women who could afford all this toxic luxury also had access to imported perfumes from the Orient, rose water distillations and camphor-laced tonics. They literally smelled like angels while their skin peeled off in sheets. If you had a functioning pair of eyebrows in Renaissance Florence, you clearly weren't trying hard enough. In the never-ending quest to resemble a bottle painting or a particularly fashionable egg, Renaissance women pluck their hairlines and eyebrows into oblivion. A high, rounded forehead was considered the epitome of beauty. The higher your forehead, the more noble and intelligent you appeared. So women willingly yanked out rows of hair from their brows and along their hairline with tweezers, rough cloth, or even seashells. This wasn't a one-time affair. It was routine maintenance, a weekly ritual of pain and precision. For stubborn hairs, women rubbed in concoctions made from walnut oil or cat dung. Yes, cat dung to thin the regrowth. Some even scorch stray hairs off with candle flames because nothing says grace and refinement like lighting your face on fire. Eyebrows thin, arched, and barely visible, if at all. A truly sophisticated woman had no visible brows. Instead, a soft shadow or trace was painted in later, often with burnt cork or powdered charcoal, which sounds elegant until you realise it's smeared terribly in the Florentine heat. Imagine your eyebrows slowly dripping down your cheeks during Mass. Divine. Meanwhile, body hair was seen as animalistic and unclean. Women removed it with a paste made from vinegar, quick lime and arsenic, another charming blend. The mixture burned, but hey, it left the skin smooth until it didn't, and the scalp. Hair was gathered up into tight, rigid styles, often braided and padded with false hair made from wool, horse hair, or someone else's actual hair. Sometimes hairpieces were soaked in lye and bleached to match the fashionable golden hue of the season. If it didn't match, no worries. Just wear a cap over it and pretend it did. Renaissance problem solving at its finest. The irony, all this hair removal and sculpting was done without mirrors. That's right. Mirrors were rare and expensive. Most women styled themselves by feel with help from servants. So your maid better have steady hands and zero passive aggression. One wrong move and your widow's peak becomes amongst tonsure. Renaissance beauty was less about natural charm and more about strategic subtraction. Remove the brows, remove the hairline, remove common sense, all in the name of elegance. Once the face had been thoroughly powdered, plucked and poisoned, it was time to move on to the body. Specifically, squeezing it into shapes the human rib cage had no business aspiring to. Enter the Renaissance corset, equal parts fashion statement and orthopedic trauma. Renaissance corsets weren't quite the wasp-waisted death traps of later centuries, but they still meant business. Known as stays or bodies, these early versions were designed to flatten the torso, not cinch it. The goal was to create a smooth, rigid canvas that emphasised the bust and elongated the silhouette.